Hello, thank you very much for joining us at this webinar from the journal's editorial team at the Royal Society. My name is Helen Eaton and I'm joined by my colleague Buchi Okerefo, who will speak to you a bit later. We both work in the in-house team at the Royal Society, overseeing the day-to-day running of some of our journals. We're based in London, though both of us are talking to you today from our own homes. Okay, so just before we get started, let me just run through a few things about how this is going to work. So as some of you will have already seen, we've got a different system called Slido on the go. So if you go to slido.com and put in that code, B695, you'll be able to submit questions through that link. That's the only way that we're taking questions for this webinar. You can do this on your phone or another device, it's fine. There's also a short survey there, so it would be really helpful for us if you could just answer the questions shown there. So we'll be taking questions right at the end of the presentation. Okay, so just to introduce you to us briefly before we really start, the Royal Society is the UK's Academy of Sciences. As well as publishing, we do lots of other activities, including things like policy work, funding research, and holding scientific events. You can find out about all of these other activities by visiting the Royal Society's website. So one of our journals, Philosophical Transactions, is actually the longest running scientific journal in the world, and it was founded in 1665. Today, we publish 10 journals which cover all areas of science and the history of science. Buchi is going to tell you a bit more about each of our journals later on in the presentation. So here's an outline of what we're going to cover today. First of all, I will talk a little bit about how to pick a journal to submit to. I will then hand over to Buchi, who will explain some of the aspects of how the publishing process works and how understanding this can help you as an author. She will also tell you a little bit more about our journals at the end. There will also be plenty of time for questions. We think that the actual talk will only take about 20-25 minutes, so we've got about half an hour for questions at the end. So please submit these during using Slido throughout the presentation. We probably won't be able to cover everything in this talk, so please ask anything that you would particularly like to know about. Slido allows you to see other people's questions submitted and click to upvote them if they're of particular interest. So please do this so that we can see what you really want to hear more about at the end. So the first part of this is about things to consider when selecting a journal to submit your research to. There are many different reasons why it's important to think carefully about which journal to submit to, and it will depend in part on what you're trying to achieve as an author. For example, sometimes you will want to reach a core specialist audience, whereas sometimes you might want to reach a new or an interdisciplinary audience. Picking the right journal can help you with this. In other situations, you might actually be being pushed to make certain decisions depending on the requirements from others, such as your university or your funder. In all cases, targeting the right journal can help to make the process as smooth as possible and increase your chance of success. It's very important to think critically and realistically about your work right at the start when you're choosing which journal to submit to. However good your research paper is, journals have their own criteria about what they publish, and understanding this and assessing whether your paper fits their criteria is really essential. For example, some journals only publish the absolutely most important breakthroughs and very novel content. Others are aimed at a very broad audience and are therefore looking for papers that have wide applications, whereas others are specialists for a particular field. So working out realistically where your paper sits within this field of different journals is really important. And it's always good to aim high, of course, but you're just wasting your time and those of the journal's editors and reviewers by aiming too high or going for an unrealistic journal. So once you've assessed your own paper, you need to have a careful look at potential journals to see which one will actually suit your requirements the best. One of the best ways to find the right journal is to look at where others have published similar work. Look at the literature in your subject area to see where papers are published, and also look at their reference lists to see which journals they are citing. As mentioned before, it's essential to be realistic when choosing comparison articles. Even if they're on a similar topic or subject area to yours, they might actually be a very different type of article. Browsing the table of contents lists for a particular journal will give you a really good sense of what that journal is looking for. It is also always worth asking your colleagues for their recommendations about what journals they've published in. If you can see that some authors always publish or publish very regularly in a particular journal, then that could also be a good indication, as it might mean that they're happy with the service that they get there. Repeat custom is a really good indicator of a good journal experience. So of course, it's also important to make sure that the right people are going to find your article. So ensure that the journal that you pick is actually indexed in the key search databases that you use to find material yourself. So for example, Web of Science or PubMed. If your work is likely to be of interest to a non-academic audience, such as practitioners, for example, you might need to look at open access or free access options. If your material is likely to be of particular public interest, then you might want to look for a publisher that will actually help you to promote your paper. So for example, through press releases or marketing of individual papers. So you've probably all heard about different types of journal metrics. Metrics can give you some insight into a journal's performance, but we always urge you to please be very careful when using these. For example, the impact factor is the most well-known metric and is often used to make assessments on research output. However, the impact factor is an average, and it's therefore highly affected by one or two very highly cited papers, and doesn't really give you a good idea of how your own paper might perform. Looking at the performance of an individual paper that is similar to yours could be a lot more useful. So for example, looking at, and ways to do this, there's various ways to do this. So for example, you can look at the altmetric score. So that's this colorful ring on the bottom right of this slide. This is a score that's given to individual papers that shows you how much the paper has actually been mentioned in places like social media or blogs and things like that, which in some fields that can actually be a better indication of impact than actual citations. The number of downloads the paper receives can also give you a really good sense of how many people are reading an individual article. So the Royal Society and our journals are signatories of something called DORA, which is the Declaration on Research Assessment. This is an initiative which works to improve the ways in which the outputs of scholarly research are evaluated, where the quality of paper is actually more important than the journal title or the publisher. One of the ways that we are involved with this is by actually publishing a range of different metrics and including these article level metrics and not just relying on the impact factor. So we know that speed is very important to authors, and it's certainly something to consider when picking a journal. Many publishers show their average times on their website, and you can also look at this yourself from dates given on an individual paper. So for example, the submission date and the publication date. However, please do always bear in mind that these are averages and times cannot be guaranteed by the journal. As you'll see in the next section of this presentation, there are many stages to go through where your paper could potentially be delayed. You need to make sure that you will also be happy with the service that the journal will offer you and how your final published paper will look. So you should read some papers in the journal to see whether they have been edited well and are easy to read and navigate. It is particularly important to make sure that your chosen journal can cater for any special requirements that you might have. So for example, if you've got a lot of video content or particularly large files or supplements, then just make sure before you submit that the journal will be able to handle those. Something that may or may not be important to you is who will benefit from your research. All journal publishers make money from author fees or library subscriptions. For societies and other not-for-profit organisations, this can be one of their main revenue streams and actually allows them to carry out a lot of their services to the scientific community, both by covering running costs for their organisation, but also as funds for meetings or prizes, for example. The Royal Society publishes our journals ourselves, but many other societies actually partner with commercial publishers, and in those circumstances, both parties will benefit from that. So just before we end this first section, a word of warning. Just please make sure that you check that your chosen journal is reputable. Once your paper's published, it's actually very difficult to get that back or to publish that work elsewhere. There are lots of journals out there and some have very similar names, so please do check carefully before clicking on the submit button. There are resources out there to help you, such as the Directory of Open Access Journals. There's something called the Think, Check, Submit website that we've given a link to there. This also provides very useful checklists in many languages to help you to make the right choice. And we'll give you a few more links to other places at the end of this webinar. Before I hand over to Bucci to tell you a bit more about the publishing process, I just want to remind you, and for those of you that joined a little bit late, that please log into Slido to submit your questions on any aspect of this presentation, and there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. So now I'm going to hand over to Bucci.
Thank you, Helen, and hello, everyone. So in this section, we will be taking a look behind the scenes of the publishing process to help you better understand how it all works and hopefully give you the best chance of getting your work successfully published. So what actually happens to your paper? So for some, the peer review process can seem like a magical black box where your paper disappears into, you don't really know what's happened to it and when it happened, and then at the end, you're presented with several different outcomes. What you can see from this journal stream is a typical process that involves multiple people at multiple stages and often means multiple processes. So in this example, once the author submits, the editorial office checks the suitability and completeness of the paper. This is then sent to a handling or associate editor who checks if the research presented is sound, and they're the ones that are responsible for deciding whether the manuscript goes to peer review or not. The editors may choose 2, 3, or possibly more reviewers to cover different topics covered in the paper, and the reviewers are carefully selected to ensure that they have the right expertise and do not have any conflicts of interests. The reports are then evaluated by the handling editor, who makes a recommendation, and it is then that the editor who is responsible makes the final decision. So as you can see with the number of people and stages in the process, that it does cost everyone in terms of time. And so it really is worth paying attention and addressing the feedback given throughout the process where possible, and that is key to success. One thing to note is that rejection can happen at many different stages of the process, and these are for different reasons. So it is always good to pay attention to the feedback and ask the editors for clarity where you're not sure. Of course, journals have different stages and models, and we'll look at those in a moment. So the board is usually made up of carefully selected experts covering the journal's scope, and they tend to be either professional editors that work in-house or external practicing scientists, or a mixture of both. It is well worth looking at the board to see if you recognise the editors, and perhaps they are researchers whose work you admire, and you do recognise the boards and the people and their publications. So these are all good indications of suitability. So the job of the editor is multifaceted. A journal is only good as its team, and it relies on the expertise of editors for their assessment, to oversee the peer review process and to reject papers that are out of scope. and this in turn helps to limit the workload of the reviewers. Editors also have the job to look for evidence of misconduct and deal with any ethical issues. They're also on hand to help answer queries from authors or reviewers relating to the scientific content. Firstly, editors check that the paper itself is in scope. As Helen outlined earlier, authors can fall at this first hurdle by not selecting the right venue for their work. Editors essentially ask for three things when they assess the paper. Is it new? Is it true? And does it add value? What they really want to know are the reasons why you want to publish and why you think it is important and why you want to share your work. And in reality, given that we just described that many of these editors are practicing scientists, they themselves are limited in time, and some editors will judge a paper on the abstract and title alone. And this is where writing a good abstract really comes into play. The value of an abstract shouldn't be ignored, and it is a powerful tool to summarize why the work was done and what the problem is being addressed, and what you actually did, what you found out, and what your conclusion is. Most journals will say on their website what their review process is, so we would recommend that you check the information given for reviewers and authors. The three most common types of peer review are single blind, double blind, and open peer review. Over time, new models have developed, such as transparent or collaborative and post peer review, and these are all variations from quite a standard approach. Peer review itself is constantly evolving, with new models taking over traditional ways. So it is worth looking at these closely to make sure that you are happy with the process for the journal you choose. So to go through what these processes mean, single blind means that the authors don't know the identity of the reviewer. Double blind means that the reviewer doesn't know the identity of the author and vice versa. Open peer review, the identity of the author and the reviewer is known by all participants, perhaps during or after the review process. However, the level of information made available can vary depending on the journal. Other types of peer review does include transparent peer review, which we will discuss in a moment. Collaborative, this is a type where two or more reviewers can work together and submit one unified report, or the author revises the manuscript under the supervision of one or more reviewers. And post-publication review is also something that is emerging, and this means that reviews are solicited or unsolicited of the published paper, and peer review occurs afterwards. So some of the journals, as mentioned, do operate open peer review, and this means that the review process is made as transparent as possible. In most cases, this means that the reviewer reports, the decision letter, any associated author responses are made public to readers alongside the published articles. Some publishers do allow reviewers to choose whether or not they wish to share their identity, but they do also encourage them to share their reports, as is done on some of our journals, including Open Biology, Royal Society Open Science, Proceedings A and Proceedings B. So you may be familiar with the term transfer or cascade journal. This is where your work has been judged to be unsuitable for that particular journal, but some publishers may offer other options to transfer your work to another one of their journals. So for an example, our journal, Royal Society Open Science, offers this option, and it accepts manuscripts from our other journals. The benefits to this include saving time to you as authors, since you won't need to start a new submission elsewhere, and it helps you find a home for your research. Articles that are transferred are then evaluated through the journal's usual processes, and that helps to ensure the article's quality, to make sure it's valid and is also relevant. It should be noted that the offer of a transfer is not a guarantee of acceptance. So here you'll see a list of resources which you may find useful. And please feel free to take a snapshot of this, and we'll pause it a moment to give you a chance to do that. So just to tell you a bit more about us, our publishing model is driven by the mission of the Royal Society, which is to recognise, promote and support excellence in science. As previously mentioned, we publish 10 journals covering all areas of science and the history of science. Our journals are divided into what we call the A-side journals, which focus on the physical sciences, mathematics and engineering. So if your interests are in these areas, we do recommend that you take a look at Proceedings A and also Royal Society Open Science, which publishes across all of science. Proceedings B is our flagship journal in biology and life sciences, and Biology Letters publishes short and innovative pieces in this area. Open Biology is our open access journal specialising in cellular and molecular biology. Interface bridges the gap between the life sciences and physical sciences. We also publish theme issues from prominent guest editors. So there are many good reasons to publish with the Royal Society. These are just some of them listed here, and that includes fast peer review handled by expert scientists, open access and open data options, and many of our journals allow direct submission from preprint servers. We also provide support to promote your research afterwards and have a fantastic press office who work to do this. They work closely with the authors to help get your research out there to an international audience. Our journals publish a wide range of articles, and these include registered reports, replication studies, reviews, opinion pieces, evidence synthesis articles, along with many other innovative outlets. So we do recognise that publishing isn't just a traditional form anymore, and this means that we accommodate many different types of research and results, and we hope that our journals can offer you a suitable home for your work.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Bucci. We're just going to have before we move on to the Q&A session, we're just going to have a quick look at the results of the survey that you filled in earlier, just to see who you are and what you've told us. Let me just get right. So we asked you where in the world you were. So it looks like there's quite a lot in the UK, but yeah, quite a diversity of people. US, Canada, Pakistan, India, Sudan. Gosh, thank you all very much for joining us. It's great. Career level, we asked you, so overwhelmingly PhD students, which is perfect. I think you're who we had in mind that this was aimed at. Okay, so most of you have never been an author, also good. This is good training for you then. Scary 2% of people who are editors or editorial board members. Don't judge us too much on what we've been saying, thanks. Great, this is really useful for us to know who we're aiming at. And the most important factor for you, publishing similar work in your field. Yeah, that's not particularly surprising. That's really good. Thank you. Right, so we're going to move on to the questions now. I have been sent a number of questions to go through, so let's get started. Just bear with me 1 second while I get back to where I'm meant to be. Right. So our first question sent in was, I believe that the Royal Society charges authors a fee for publishing articles as open access. Can I request a waiver if I don't have the funds available? So I was going to take this, but I might actually pass over to Buchi to do the first one because she's in charge of an open access journal. So Buchi, if you don't mind, do you want to take this first one?
Yes, certainly. So yes, many of our journals, particularly our open access journals, Open Biology, Royal Society, Open Science, will consider waivers in cases where APC funds for APC are lacking. So we are signed up to an initiative called Research for Life, and these mean that we have waivers, so authors from certain areas are eligible for full waivers. So it's worth going onto our website. We also, part of our the submission process, we have waiver forms where you can apply for these waivers, and I should say that it's not included in the editorial process, so the consideration is completely independent, so you don't need to worry about it affecting the outcome of your paper. So we would consider these on a case-by-case basis. So the best thing is to include as much evidence as you can as to why you don't have the funds, and that's a lot easier for our team to consider it.
Great, thanks. Okay, question number 2 that I've got here is, do you publish negative results? So I'll take this one. Yes, some of our journals do. So our journal, Royal Society Open Science in particular, is a journal that considers papers based on something called objective peer review. So that means that there's no emphasis on whether the article is particularly sort of impactful. As long as the science and the research has been done in the right way and it's a good, solid scientific study, then that journal will consider it. And the reviewers are told not to make decisions based on sort of novelty or excitement. Having said that, I mean, of course, it does have to be doing something reasonably new, but a study that, for example, has got a negative result set, we feel that it's important to actually get those results out into the scientific literature. That then hopefully limits the same research being done more than once by different groups if they know that that experiment has been done and it didn't work out as hoped. So yes, so please do submit your negative results studies to Royal Society Open Science. That's great. Okay, next question is, so you seem to suggest that open access journals are not for a core specialist audience. What criteria should be met to include OA journals in your choice of the right journal? Buchi, can I hand over to you again, please?
Well, I mean, given that we have 2 open access journals here, and one I would say is more specialized than the other, I think it completely depends on the subject area.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think that that probably comes from my early side, where you had that the sort of what do you call it? Don't know, the sort of field of different types of journals. So open access journals can be for specialist audiences. I think on that slide we did have an open access journal as an example of a potentially very broad journal, but actually any journal can be open access now. And I mean, a lot of journals now are becoming open access journals, having traditionally been subscription journals. So actually it shouldn't be the case that you think of an OA journal as being a non-specialist journal. It could be a specialist journal. Sorry, that's going around in circles a little bit, but I think these days in particular, OA journals should be treated in the exact same way as any other journals in terms of looking for the right place for your research. I mean, there is a concern from some people that there's a lot of open access journals out there that are maybe less high quality than traditional journals, but again, that doesn't cover all open access journals. Obviously, there's a lot of exceptionally good open access journals in the same way that there are poor subscription journals. So I think, again, I don't think that you should really be thinking of an OA journal as a different type of thing than a non-OA journal these days. All right, let me pull up the next question. Okay, the Royal Society is a society publisher. Can you tell us a bit more about the difference between society and commercial publishers? How does the Royal Society use the money publishing makes? That's a very good question. So commercial publishers tend to use the income from journals as a business. It's a commercial business. So they have shareholders, they have, etc. Whereas societies, the profits from journals tend to go back into other activities. But as I said earlier, actually, a lot of commercial publishers partner with societies. So often there will be sort of, maybe the society will own the journal, but the publishers make money from it, or they co-own the journal. The commercial publishers tend to, in general, be a lot bigger than society publishers. So they've actually got a lot more, they've got a lot more funds to do things like have all the technology and do big developments that maybe societies wouldn't be able to afford to do. Certainly, I mean, some of the major players in the field are commercial publishers. So, for example, like Wiley and Taylor and Francis, Springer, those sorts of things would be commercial publishers, but they do publish a lot on behalf of societies. That probably doesn't answer that very well. But anyway, go on. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to add that often you'll see society journals. More often than not, the editorial boards are made up of their members, and so you can see that a lot of what is being published in that particular area tends to go to that publisher or that journal or that society. So it could be sometimes quite an insular thing, but if you're trying to look for somewhere focused, you may wish to go to a society journal, for instance.
And in terms of how the Royal Society uses the money that publishing makes, well, I mean, to pay my salary, no, but there's much more to it than that. So the journals program is actually quite a big component of money coming into the Royal Society. We do get money from a lot of other sources, but a lot of the time that money is tied up into particular things. So, for example, it will be money that has to go into a particular funding program or for a particular prize or something like that. Whereas money that comes in from the publishing side of things is a bit freer for the Royal Society to do what it needs to do in terms of the day-to-day running of the organisation. But also, I mean, we do a lot of stuff, like a lot of the policy, the work that we do doesn't necessarily bring in money, so it relies on funding from the journals, hold lots of events, that sort of thing. So the money that comes into us very much goes back out to the scientific community. Richie, was there anything you wanted to add on that, or should I move on to the next?
No, that's all good. Thank you.
Okay. So next one is, what should I do if a reviewer requests changes that are outside my time frame or budget? You can take this one if you like.
Yeah, I think the first thing I would recommend the author do is to get in touch with the editorial team or the editor and say, I mean, what the problem is. If it's asking for more time, the journals can tend to be flexible. Obviously, it's very important to pay attention to the timescales involved, and to ensure that you don't miss any limits to when you can resubmit your work, for instance. Budget-wise, this tends to be a bigger issue in that perhaps you're limited with what revisions have been suggested, and that's definitely one to raise with the editor, because it could be actually quite welcome that the reviewer has given feedback that might open avenues to another paper or different, taking your research to another, in a different stream, which could be you don't have to necessarily focus that on the paper you're currently on. So the good thing is to ask whether how much how many changes are needed, whether that could go on to a different a different topic, and budget wise, I mean, yeah, it's good to, if it's a funding issue, that might have to go back to the institution. And again, if it's a publishing funding issue, like we mentioned about waivers, those requests that can come to the editorial office.
I would just add to that when you're responding to requests from a reviewer, you shouldn't necessarily feel like you have to do absolutely everything that the reviewer has asked. What you should be doing, though, is writing a very sort of very thorough response to the reviews. In that response to the reviews, you can say, I do not feel like this is suitable for this paper, or I do not feel like this is relevant at this time, or this is something we're going to do at a later stage. You don't necessarily have to do everything, you just need to respond to all the requests. And then it's up to the editor to actually look at your responses and decide whether you've done sufficient levels to accept it, or they might send it back to the reviewers. But I think as long as you've responded to each point, then you don't necessarily have to have actually followed their recommendations. It's up to you to sort of go back to them and say, I don't agree with this, for example. Okay, yeah, right, I'll do next question. Okay. How important is it for the author to suggest reviewers at the submission stage in terms of speeding the process up? So I would say it's incredibly helpful. Editors find it very useful to have suggestions, but that does not mean that we're going to use your suggestions. Often we will, but often usually we will find our own people as well. But just having an idea of the sorts of people that you think it's important to see this, just even in terms of sort of looking at their subject areas, then that can be extremely helpful for our editors. What we would not recommend really ever is for you to have approached these people and said, I'm going to recommend that you review my article, because I mean, reviewers should in that case decline, because that would be a conflict of interest. But in terms of actually just suggesting people whose opinions you would really value, then that's very helpful. You are also welcome to, most journals will let you also say if there's reviewers that you don't want that journal to approach. Again, though, it's up to the journal. The journal might approach them anyway. It's still useful for us to know. If you are giving us reviewers that you don't want us to approach, it's always worth expanding on that in your cover letter to say really why these people shouldn't be approached. If it's just a case of that you have different opinions on something, that doesn't really preclude them from being a reviewer. But if there's a real sort of personal problem there or something, then it would be good for the editors to know about that. Buchi, do you want to add anything to that?
Only just to say, yes, so it does depend on the journal policy, because some do have quite strict criteria in who they will consider. For instance, if you suggest someone who's from the same institution, they tend to not invite that person. They obviously will not recommend you asking your mates to review it, because it will be flagged as a conflict of interest, and it's likely the editor will look to see what has been published in the area and what your recent collaborations are. And on that note, some journals, for instance, will rule out asking any reviewers who you've had a collaboration with within like the previous 5 years. So, but they are, like as Helen said, editors find preferred and non-preferred reviews really useful for their assessment.
Okay, great. So next question is, why do journals use different types of peer review process? Why don't they all use the same method? Buchi, do you want to have a look?
Yeah, I think it's like we mentioned earlier in the webinar, the peer review model is constantly evolving, and some ways aren't fit for purpose, and some publishers prefer using different ways. It's, you know, as our journals have shown, we've, you know, peer review's been around for over 350 years, and it's, you know, there's definitely ways it can be tweaked, and no type is perfect. I think it does also depend on the area of research. I think we were discussing single blind and double blind and those kind of processes. And it may be, I'm just giving a kind of wide example here, but say, for instance, paleontology, it might be a smaller area than, you know, cell biology. And in that instance, some journals in that field might prefer to use double blind because it's such a small area that it's, you know, some, you know, junior researchers might feel uncomfortable evaluating the work of someone who's quite eminent in the field. Therefore, if that like occurs often, double blind might be the way to go. So yeah, it's you know, one peer review process doesn't fit all, I'm afraid. But again, it's worth checking what you're comfortable with as an author for choosing where you want to submit to.
Okay, thanks. Right, next question is, how do you check for plagiarism? So plagiarism is something that will actually be covered in another webinar next week. So if you're particularly interested in plagiarism, please sign up for that. But so plagiarism, there's different types of plagiarism. So first of all, there's plagiarism where the author is taking somebody else's work totally. But there's also something called self-plagiarism, which is sort of reusing your own work over and over again. In both cases, there are various ways. So some journals use software to check every single paper on submission. So there's something called, well, we use something called Authenticate. You run a manuscript file through this system, and it sort of trawls the internet and comes back with a report on how much overlap there is between this work and work that's already out there. It's then up to the editor to look at this report and decide whether it meets, whether it's plagiarized or not plagiarized. So it does take a bit of manual looking at this and getting used to it, because, for example, so the report gives a paper a score, which is a sort of percentage of how much it's been reused. But a paper might have a high score, but actually a lot of that is, say, a very similar method section or something like that, which the editor would look at and probably think, well, that's okay. Whereas other papers, if, say, the whole results section was taken pretty much from a different paper, then that would probably not be okay. So as I said, some journals will check this on every single paper. Other journals will check it if an issue is raised, say, by a reviewer or by an editor as a potential problem, and then we can run this. It's becoming more common that most of the journals check every single paper, though. Buchi, anything on that?
I mean, I would say I've found in kind of recent years that reviewers are getting more and more, I would say, just amazing at flagging things like plagiarism. And it's actually during the peer review process that they are good at commenting and saying, please, can you attribute this source to this reference, for example. So that's another way we do rely on good referees.
Okay, next one is you again, I think. Right, how important is it to publish in an open access journal?
Hugely important.
Says the person of the Editorial Open Access Journal, yes.
Of course. I mean, sorry, yeah, Helen, feel free to jump in whenever. But I would, yeah, it's now we're seeing more, it's funder mandates that are becoming prominent reasons, and also from your institution, if they are requiring that you publish in an open access journal, this is obviously going to be on, of high importance to you. Again, other reasons are criteria and how open you do want your research. So, open access means that people can reuse it, and you have to be comfortable with that as well. To have your research disseminated kind of as far as wide, open access is an obvious choice, but it's not for everyone. So yeah, it really depends on what's important for you, and what's been what you've been informed by your institution mainly.
Yeah, I think I would just add that a lot of academic institutions will have subscriptions to the major journals. So if you're just publishing for a fairly standard academic audience, then it might not be so important. But if you're really trying to reach, say, the public or the or people working, so an example that I could come up with is maybe, say, like conservation biology or something, where you actually want to get out to people who are maybe not affiliated with a particular academic institution. They might be out there in the field, but if your article is really important to them, then making sure that they can actually have access to that by paying an open access fee and publishing in an open access journal can be a good way of doing that. Yeah. Okay, next one is, does the Royal Society give any recognition to reviewers? So yes, we do some things. We do not pay reviewers, which I think reviewers would love all the journals to pay them for all their time, but sadly that's not really a viable model. But we do various things. So for example, we work with a site called Publons, which some of you might have come across, which is another database, well, a website where reviewers can actually claim credit for reviews that they do. So if they review for one of our journals, they can click a button to say claim this on Publons, and then somebody can go to their Publons account and see this person has done X number of reviews for these journals. Often it won't give you any more detail than that because there's matters of confidentiality there, but they can say that they have an approved journal in there. And the hope is that their employers can actually use that to see all the other work that academics are doing day to day. Other things that we do are things like we publish a list of all of our reviewers at the end of the year for some of our journals, just to give them a little bit of credit in the journal. But yes, not much else beyond that, unfortunately, except for our very deserved thanks, because reviewers do a huge amount of work and don't always get the credit that they deserve. Buchi, you've probably got something to add to that.
I would say just we mentioned it earlier in the signing of reports. So in journals where they operate transparent peer review, you can see who's signed that, and I think that's a nice way not only for the reviewer to kind of disclose who they are and give that transparency to the process, but in a way that it gives them the recognition that they're happy to put their name to the quality of their review, for instance. And also we do advocate co-reviewing as well. So some of you may be familiar with working with your PIs or your colleagues on co-reviewing. So again, where it's opportunity to add your name, we encourage that, because as Helen said, good reviewers are difficult to come by, and we definitely want to encourage you to take this up and get recognition that is deserved.
Thanks. Okay, what's the average number of reviewers a paper will have? I'm working on one with 5, which seems like so I can't talk for all journals here because other publishers will have different rules, but we tend to aim for 2 reviewers as a minimum. It really depends on the paper though. I mean, some of our journals publish really interdisciplinary work, which actually it's very hard to find 2 reviewers that would be able to cover all aspects of that paper. So sometimes you might need more reviewers to actually look at different aspects of that paper. 5 reviewers all covering the same subject area does seem like quite a lot, but one of the other problems that we sometimes have is that actually not everybody will agree to review. So sometimes an editor might have to ask, say, 5 or 6 people in the hope that 2 people will agree. But say, for example, 5 people agreed. Some editors might sort of tell them that they're not needed, but others might sort of feel that actually more is better. So let them all report, and that's great. We always sort of feel that, I guess, more reviews is better than not enough reviews. Yeah. Anything else on that?
No, that's all. Yeah.
Okay, just see what the time is. 6 minutes. Right, I think we've probably got time for 1 or 2 more. Sorry, I'm just going to flick through the questions that have been sent. Okay, let's do this one. Sorry, okay, right. I think this might be the last question. So, right. Much research these days is interdisciplinary in nature, and do the Royal Society journals provide scope for this? Bitch, do you want to say?
Yeah, I'll start off and say we described a few of our journals, which was like Royal Society Open Science, which covers all sciences. So I mean, interdisciplinary is kind of in their nature as well. We briefly mentioned Interface, which was we call that our cross-disciplinary journal, and that publishes research in the kind of crosshairs between physical and biological sciences. So that could be anything from bioengineering, nanotechnology. So yeah, a few of the journals do cover this. I think just how the journals have evolved, especially that, and as Helen said, that most research these days is very interdisciplinary. So I think, that our journal scopes have accommodated this, and it's quite expected that lots of the papers will cover different areas of science.
I would add that we're actually quite an unusual publisher in that all of our journals really are very, very broad scope. Most publishers will have a sort of a bigger portfolio with more niche journals, and I mean smaller societies as well will be dealing with a much smaller subject area, where even our most narrow, well, I guess open biology might be one of our more narrow ones, but even that covers the entirety of cellular, molecular biology, neuroscience, all sorts of stuff. So it's by no means narrow. And some of our other journals cover, say, the whole of the life sciences or the whole of science in Royal Society Open Sciences case. So yeah, we are very unusual, actually. I think most publishers, as I said, would have narrower journals that maybe can't cope with truly interdisciplinary papers as well as our journals can, actually. Okay, well, it's 4 minutes to 5 here, so I think we'll wrap things up there. but thank you all very much for joining us. If you found this useful, we do have another webinar same time next week on understanding journal policies and requirements. This will cover a bit more detail about things like open access, preprints and data archiving, for example. There was a link to this webinar in the joining instructions that you were sent earlier today. We would also love to hear from you. Please follow us on social media. If you've got any feedback on this presentation, please do email us, and please also have a look at our website, royalsociety.org/journals. Thank you again for joining us. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and thank you. Bye.